The portal's inquiry is, where does the future come from? The entangled provocation is that today and tomorrow are not merely the continuation of yesterday. This is a living universe where evolving properties and possibilities emerge not just from what has been in a linear sense, in that the creational act involving us humans reveals emergent and transcendent emanatory configurations that are nascent and novel, where our self-arising and self-authored consciousness partners in this creative universal dance. In this sense, we humans are co-creators, receivers, and emanators of universal novelty and divinity. The suggestion is not some aggrandized, big-headed, how special each of our personalities are, but rather the recognition and appreciation that in universal terms, the configuration we each bring is utterly unique and special. A once in the history of the universe algorithmic composition, where the contemplative inquiry offers that fact could itself be a pathway into a sacred actuality. We are describing an ecology where theological and epistemic inquiries and the subtle, causal, and interpersonal actualities interpenetrate and emergently infuse each other. It is these kind of appreciations that engender the great fascination with leading-edge laboratories of discovery, where humans come together to become portals for the future in how we are evolving and emerging anew. Margaret Mead said a century ago, "Never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. In fact, it is the only thing that ever has." We can today paraphrase by saying, never underestimate the emergent power of a nucleonic or holonic conscious fractal to transform the universe at large. It potentially is actuating at any moment, even right here, right now. We are in the presence of just such a fractal of possibility with the Metamodern Spirituality Lab and their unique exploration of God. And we are asking, how is God doing at its own liminal edge with you and through you? Well, so how about that for a moment of Laymanesque opening? You may wonder, have I watched too much of Layman? But is there such a thing too much in a generative surplus model? For that, we go to the surplus prophet himself. Welcome, Layman. Welcome, Brendan.
Nice to be here, Aviv. That was a beautiful introduction. We are in rural Vermont at the Metamodern Spirituality Lab, which has just wrapped up after a week of pre-retreat and then an intensive weekend discussion and exercises and poetic ritual and community making, this time around the theme of God, or God in quotation marks. We've just sent the final participants off on their way this morning, and we're still buzzing with the field of what we've done here, integrating it into ourselves and starting to get those vague premonitions of what the next one might be as an unfolding extension of what this one was for us.
And Brendan, as the host, and probably more than merely the host, where are you right now? I mean, I suppose given you're just coming out or still in this experience, the natural place to begin is by asking, what are you in right now? And what does it feel like?
Yeah. Well, thanks for this opportunity to talk about it. They're very powerful experiences. I'm still sitting, I guess, with the just deepening sense of community, which is something that I deeply relate to at the end of and during all of these gatherings that we've been doing. And that seems to have a kind of momentum to it, this deepening sense of this field and the kinds of conversations and things we can explore in it, the affordances of this particular configuration of minds and bodies and souls together in space, in real physical space, which is always, I think, the most powerful thing for me. And again, still kind of feeling that and appreciating that, being able to come together with this tribe, with this group of people that I feel deeply enmeshed with in a kind of, I guess you could use a word like church in a kind of broad, sociological sense, the way that Durkheim talked about a church, any kind of intentional group of folks who are sort of oriented towards the sacred and trying to deepen into that together and what comes out of that. So yeah, I've still got that post metamodern spirituality gathering buzz, and happy to talk about what we're getting up to here and to jam a little bit on what all that is about. Yeah.
Well, I'm tempted to flow with a glow, so to speak, and at the same time, I'm recognizing that logistically for the conversation, it'll be helpful to get a bit of a grounding of the location and the logistics of the place and how many people were with you and how did you run the experience and whatever you want to offer about that, and specifically the shared intention that you brought to this experience, and then we can take it and flow wherever the conversation goes.
Well, maybe Brendan, you want to describe the sort of architecture and layout here, then I can talk about the process of the week.
Sure. Yeah, so these gatherings happen here at Sky Meadow, there's Sky Meadow Retreat Center. It's a 115-acre homestead and sort of working organic farm and gathering place. And within that sort of container, I recently set up what I've called Sky Meadow Institute, which is really directing this incredible, beautiful place in the direction of gatherings and events and that are particularly sort of germane to this leading edge liminal metamodern space of discussion, trying to bring in those communities and have a place where we can gather and explore issues and relationships together. So that's sort of the institutional context, and so far that's been something very, very flourishing. And this event is part of a set of events, a kind of seasonal thing that we do here. The Metamodern spirituality gatherings. There's a spring and a fall gathering that we do. And so there's a kind of cyclical, seasonal component to it, and this was the spring one. And that's important for a lot of ways, and maybe Layman can talk more about that in a second, but just appreciating the place-based aspect of community and being able to really see the changes that occur in the landscape and the vegetation and watching, in a sense, the gardens grow. We kind of come, in a sense, plant something in the spring, and then when folks return in the fall, they can see the development and the progress that's ready by harvest time, that sort of a thing. So that's kind of the cyclical, calendrical framing of these specific gatherings. But these happen, again, as part of Sky Meadow Institute's sort of broader programming of similar related kinds of events. And we've got a number of things coming up this year that are very adjacent to these kinds of ideas and these kinds of conversations. And then zooming out more, just this beautiful piece of property in which Sky Meadow exists is many acres of woods, kind of surrounding this beautiful little nucleus of a bunch of small cottages and cabins and ponds, with a renovated old dairy barn that now serves as sort of the hub of the gathering space where people come, and has the history of being intended originally as a meditation hall, actually. And so that was one of the initial motivations for the retreat transformation of this beautiful property. So it's a space that is just a kind of sanctuary. It's quiet. You hear chirping. You hear birds outside. You hear the frogs in the ponds, and and I think there's a kind of beautiful, idyllic pastoral quality which allows a kind of opening, a freshness and a kind of expansiveness for very expansive discussions and deepening emotional connections to occur in. So that's kind of the rough setting the stage. But Layman can talk more about the process specific to these gatherings.
Sure. I'm glad you mentioned the seasonal aspect. I just came from the Icon Integral Conference in Denver and gave a talk on archaic futurism. So one of the things that's very important to me is how we bring into our leading edge practice those things that allowed community and culture and human existential development to flourish in the ancient world. And one of those things is having a sacred calendar, right? It's very nice to have online networks, and it's very nice to have in-person gatherings. But something else happens when there's a kind of predictability where it can be part of your regular year, where people can re-encounter each other, where they can sink more deeply into the land each time and be embedded in a place. All of that stuff would have been the absolutely normal way that the production of culture and human development and sacred community was done for 100,000 years. So we need to renormalize that again in a certain way. So what we do here, and it evolves each time we are experimenting and picking something up that starts to become part of our repeated iteration. Generally, it's a week long, and the first 5 days will be what we call the pre-retreat, where people who want to help construct the weekend come together. And that consists of days that begin with a formal meditation and then a collective sourcing between each other and the landscape of what we want the opening ceremony and the creative poetic ritual to be that begins and ends the weekend. And we work with the land, try to be of service to it, but we largely come together around joint contemplation of a particular theme at the intersection of spirituality and metamodern or liminal or game B or integral kind of thinking. So the question of God was the contemplative point this time. And we worked through that in combination with the landscape and each other and creating this ritual, doing different kinds of practices. One of the reasons we're calling it a lab now, we used to call it a retreat, but it's important to us that this be an experimental place for people to create their literature, create their visions, create their practices, and especially to try out their leading edge practices with reliable peers. And my sense is we're in these really rich networks with really deep, sophisticated people, all of whom have practices they count on or practices they're curious to try, and they would love to share with their community and their friends and get feedback on it. So we want it to be really creative, fertile, kind of generative space. Usually at the end of that 5-day period, usually on the fourth night, the people who've been engaged in that special chamber together gather for a process of interpersonal appreciation, which we've found to be really powerful. It takes several hours. For me, that's kind of the highlight of the week, actually. It's really dramatic, and it kind of, to hear that kind of feedback about your virtues and weaknesses from people you legitimately trust can be almost emotionally devastating. It makes you have to be the person that they feel you are. That's a beautiful thing. And then more people will gather. So that's usually, 5 to 10 people, somewhere in that range. And then another 20 to 30 people might come over the course of the weekend. And during the weekend, we have more intensive series of talks, presentations, practices, and group inquiries around the dominant theme of the event. Beginning, of course, with the opening ceremony that we all go through. This time we passed through the forest and up the hill, and there were blindfolds and music, and we moved through stations corresponding to phases of humanity's relationship to divinity. The last year we'd done elementally themed stations, so it's a little bit different each year. We moved from archaic to polytheistic to monotheistic to modern, postmodern, and then metamodern conceptions of spirituality. Then we have our weekend, we have our practices. We try to leave as much room for flexibility and socializing as possible because a lot of these people, as much as they do want to participate in the theme and the ritual and the practices, this may be their only chance all year to really have deep communion and private discussions with people in this network. So we want to facilitate that as well. And then we have a closing ceremony. We have dinners. We've developed this raffle process where people just keep putting gifts into a box, and at the end, somebody gets everything in that box. And then it's this morning, and we say our goodbyes to everyone and have to go about the process of tending the seeds of the next one and trying to integrate into ourselves the impressions and the energies that have been generated through the process, which I feel is sort of a devotional relationship to the liminal field that we're generating together. And it's been extraordinarily rich. You know, you don't want to get too verbally enthusiastic about something that you're kind of responsible for generating, but this has been an unbelievable, idyllic week, you know, and the reports from the people here are extraordinary. So we're quite happy with how it's been going.
Wow. Well, it's a very compelling description right from my language, the opening mumming invocation of the fractal of the entire human story in the devotional context, and how that will, if done conductively and psychoactively, will invoke the drive, the impulse right to the here and now, to the liminal edge. So it's natural to ask, what are some of the salient discoveries that have found you through the explorations of this week?
A lot of what we discover and rediscover is the flavor, the vibe, right? When you move through this thing and you come to rest in the spot where everyone is having communion and where they feel optimistic about what the next step is, it has a particular flavor. And I want to privilege that flavor over any sort of mental considerations that might come out of it. Because the main thing I think we're noticing here is how important the community field itself is. Meta models are very important. We need a lot more of them. We need transdisciplinary work. We need to find systemic, institutional, and economic variations of this. We need to do all these sorts of things. But essentially, we need to have a place where people can be welcomed in and start to balance themselves out across multiple lines and dimensions of themselves so they come to land at the leading edge more fully. A place where people who have very rich personal practices or personal models, and some people come in armed with extraordinary synthetic, developmental, multi-perspectival models they've been working on. But those need to be accepted, recognized, and sort of set back into the field, because you encounter a dozen other people who also have those models. So now you're not just a unique weirdo trying to map the future. You're in a community of these people. So you can relax a little bit about that, figure out what we all have in common, and go back out into the world with that kind of blending in place. And so I think what I'm seeing, what I'm taking away from this weekend is the sheer importance of setting up these kind of hive-like fields for the bees to go to and from. And if you get a few new ones each time, it starts to spread. And ideally, we would have dozens or hundreds of things like this around the world to be a generator of the leading edge of the culture. And as much as we need all these different subsets, what we fundamentally need is the right kind of a scene that's just a constant generator of all the different tentacles of the leading edge.
Yeah, that's well said, and I would agree. And I think that's a lot of the kind of pollinating that can happen, I think, for these sorts of things. And so there is an interesting thing. You know, I come from sort of a evangelical Christian background, and there's something about the church experience that that keeps the community together, right? You show up every week, every Sunday, and then you kind of reaffirm your commitments to each other in this thing that you're collectively doing. And sort of one of the signs that something is maybe starting to break down in either your community or your theological, spiritual world is you stop attending. And I mean, I've done that, and there's something then when you stop showing up and you stop reaffirming that commitment, then it's very easy for things to kind of dissipate and fall apart. And just using that as sort of sociological model for a second, I think there's something deeply important about having a place where we come together and gather and connect and feel this vibe and these energies with each other, and sort of remember our connections with each other and to what we're doing, and the sorts of aims and goals that we have, and the shared vision, and the friendship, and the relational connections, and being able to just continue to, I'm going to keep using this word, deepen. I guess it's something that keeps coming up for me. Just this increasing deepening into the relational field of it all is something that I find deeply renewing. And it's kind of like returning to that well of relationship with this incredible community, so that then you can disperse and go back out and feel kind of charged in that way, and sort of recharged to go hopefully be a positive complexifying impact and a negentropic impact in your more immediate local context. So that's certainly something that I always take away. This specific retreat, there were some really, I think, helpful conceptual things that and when I say conceptual too, I don't mean just in a dry sense like, oh, that's a new idea, but a new way of connecting certain ideas and ways of being in my life that helped me, I think, make some progress on certain kind of hangups that I've had. And I could talk about those, but I also don't want it to go necessarily too far into the conceptual space, but we could go there. So there are things that get generated in these conversations and in this sort of emotional field that are like, oh yeah, this is helpful. This can help me, make this sort of turn or break through a particular impasse I might have been experiencing. And for me, the impact of this one specifically is sort of something I've been sort of a nut I hadn't been able to crack maybe for some years. So being able to be in dialogue around what do we mean in this case about God, and how have we interpreted that, and how are these things shift through time and in our own developmental personal journeys, etc. Something really clicked for me that was very helpful. So there are things like that I think hopefully will occur for a number of folks. And this is always a co-learning experience. There is a sense in which, Layman is leading the discussions, or at least facilitating them. And there's a sense in which I'm kind of holding this space and serving as kind of the caretaker of the container and all of that. But ultimately, I really feel like we're coming together to learn from each other, to produce that emergent surplus cohesion that comes from a bunch of people coming together, interweaving and generating something, beyond any of its kind of mere sum of the parts. And so, yeah, there's a lot that I gain and a lot that I come away with that's just very helpful for me at a kind of intellectual, spiritual, psychological, emotional, embodied level.
Yeah, there is a very vivid sense in what you're both describing, in the reclaiming of the 3 or 5 or 7-fold dimensions that we humans are, away from the 2-dimensional, one-season Zoom universe that we often see each other, and how the connective, generative, experiential, energetic dimension of this, and what happens in people, that resonates very deeply. So, and it brings up in me the function of peak experiences. So you framed on the front end there, Layman, the sense of the cyclical, and Brandon, you actually framed the cyclical nature, or the seasonal nature, and the ritual dimension. And it occurs to me that the function, one of the functions of peak experiences is not just bragging rights into some phenomenology that attended those peak experiences, but rather the interior etching that occurs in those experiences that provide then some interior pathway for a person to make an interior pilgrimage back to those committed intentions we generated inside the presence of the collective, where we share that sense of communion. And so I'm not surprised that you're highlighting those natures. I can clearly hear in the background how you were inside the experience, and you were also concurrently mapping the conceptual framework mid-flight as you were going through the experience, and in essence flying through the experience with these concurrent perspectives. I'd like us to stay just a little more in the experiential, and if you can describe, because God's mansion has many chambers to it. And I imagine you walked into different mansions. You walked into the head mansion and a bit of theological exploration. You walked into the interpersonal heart mansion, chamber in the mansion. So describe a bit kind of the shape-shifting choreography of the experience, and what else you would want to highlight from within it that presented those kind of peak experience moments that you were then able to stay with and linger with and harvest as something to come back to.
Experientially, there's several different kinds of intersubjective peaks that go on, as well as many individual peak experiences. Some of the more powerful ones come in moments of dance and play and shared improvisational physical practices. There's a lot of movement practice and body work that goes on here. There's also a lot of people finding this to be a very healing space because they can trust the level of cognition and heart that the other people have. So they're willing to bring things forward that often surprises them. And that can often be grief or trauma or something very personal. And the way that ripples through everyone else is very powerful. So one of the things that stayed with me the most are these moments when someone has shared something almost unexpectedly, and we've all just been with the intensity of that experience, appreciating it on multiple scales. Maybe all of us are a little bit like this, but the people you most want to be able to confess your heart to are people who can hold it in different modes simultaneously, and so they become trustworthy in a multi-perspectival sense. Another kind of peak that goes on here is just to be together in front of the raw beauty of the place. And another, of course, is what comes through the shared ritual practice. I don't want to say too much about what the actual ritual is, because part of it being sacred is that it's set apart from public documentation. But for me, there was a moment where I was leading blindfolded people from postmodern to metamodern, and we took our blindfolds off, and the sun is setting, and the gazebo is playing sacred infused trance music with lights on the hilltop at dusk, and we're coming up to a higher vantage point over the place, and this shared feeling of, this is absolutely gorgeous, and we can do this. We can do this kind of a future. It's possible for people like us, for this kind of person to pull this off. And that's a feeling of a kind of confidence we need in order to take any constructive cultural and existential action going forward. Obviously, we need to grieve and appreciate death and appreciate the somberness of various aspects of the meta crisis, but we also have to be over full of a kind of love and almost foolish confidence together that it's so beautiful, we need to try, and maybe we can.
Yeah. Beautiful. This, just staying with this, it also affirms the actuality that we have moved over the last 2,500 years. We're no longer getting blinded by coming out of the cave. We're actually getting blinded by ascending to the Metamodern mountain. So, yeah, very beautiful.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think there are these different modalities of the peak experience, and one of them is the ritual, or specifically, there's a kind of nature intensity of kind of almost, that kind of nearing the nature mystical, right? If you get to the hilltop and the sun is setting and you're overlooking the lush mountains and the sky is just full of beautiful magentas and golds, and you just have that kind of deep connection with the sacred from that vantage, let's say. And so there were moments like that occur. But then there's the interpersonal kind of peak experience where those appreciation circles that we do to kind of close the pre-retreat are, I think, yeah, they stand out to me as being some of, if not the most powerful experiences from these events. It's there where I feel not just a deepening of relationship with other people, but when you do this kind of a thing with this kind of very, very sensitive intensity for an extended period of time, it generates a kind of shared energy in the room, in the space, which again, to draw back on my kind of experience with, say, Pentecostal Christianity, reminds me a little bit of that flavor of when you're in these, groups of prayer meetings or whatnot, and there's that spirit in the room. It's not that kind of sort of boisterous intensity of like people shouting in tongues or anything, but just that kind of flickering of energy in the air that somehow generated this sort of field dynamic amongst this group. And I think, that is this kind of surplus cohesion showing up and kind of being generated by this really beautiful outpouring of love amongst different people, and being able to, in a very unique way and in a way that we don't often have space for in our regular day-to-day lives, just expressing a deep, intimate regard for each other, and the way that creates a potency that can be felt amongst a group is something that to me gestures towards a kind of spiritual God experience in a very imminent way. That stands out to me. But another thing is a little bit what you were saying earlier, that there are these different ways people show up to a term like God, and having to navigate that, or I should say, actually, the invitation that presents to navigate that, because it's not a downside. It's actually a beautiful thing that is what I think leads to this push towards trying to find the optimal way of integrating so many diverse perspectives and doing that in a generative way. So, for example, here at a gathering talking about God, we had atheists and we had theists and we had non-dual mystics and we had people who are just interested, and we had people who don't have much thoughts on this topic one way, etc. So there's a lot of diverse perspectives for what's showing up, and rather than seeing that as sort of a kind of, what would you say, something that's sort of like a barrier for us to be able to come together, it's actually an opening, because whatever I want to say to signify with this term God, I want to be able to bring in all those different modes and modes of relationality to a term like that, and have it land across those different perspectives. So how can we talk about God in a way that atheists will be like, well, yeah, that sounds great. How do we talk about ultimate value and the good and these sorts of ideas in a way that isn't just sort of univocal, but it somehow is able to have a manifold plurality to it, that we can explore some deep structures there that resonate with multiple different people coming from very different places, and yet still finding some means of cohesion around this topic. And I feel like if we're able to do that, when we're able to do that, then we're succeeding in this sort of, at least at the kind of conceptual register, the linguistic register of being able to navigate a term like that in all of the fullness that it deserves. And so I'm very encouraged by that. But phenomenologically, in terms of how that lands in experience, is always this continual tracking, like, I wonder how this is landing for so and so and so and so, and trying to just sort of be open and receptive and aware about all that, and use that as sort of signals to be able to assess how the ideas and the discussions are sort of tending in certain directions, what's being left out, what needs to be emphasized, and how do we round this out, in an optimal way. So that's part of both a interpersonal, intersubjective kind of sensibility that I feel in this space, but it also leads directly into the kinds of ideas that get foregrounded in this space as a response to living from that orientation. So all of those things are aspects of the sensibility, the experiential, phenomenological vibe, at least for me.
There is in this interpersonal, intersubjective appreciation process that you're describing, and intimate viscosity that you are imbuing about the nature of this experience, it evokes for me a curious inquiry about the human condition, because what comes alive through that is the sense of how is it and why is it that we are so, perhaps the deepest yearning in all of us is to be seen, to be witnessed in the deepest possible way, and to receive oneself back in that sense. And what is that describing and telling us and revealing to us about the human condition, and actually how is that guiding the intuition about the human-God relationship in the dimension of us togethering to inhabit or to embody that actuality. So that's just totally beautiful in the way you're able to describe it. I wonder if there is anything you'd say from your own observation when you bring the analytical, reflective faculty about what is this saying about our human condition, that this is what we see to be the pinnacle of the apex of the experience.
Well, I would make two initial comments about that. One is, as many people might know, I have this integrated surplus model, right? And I think there's something we do together that creates this excess supra meaningfulness that we might call a spirit, right? It's not for no reason where two or three of you are gathered in my name, there I am. There's this sense that we have to collectively generate some kind of field of meaning that brings apotheosis to the human being, exalts us to a level of functionality and contentment and excitement and willingness to undergo efforts that is us at our shared optimum. Right? And we can't do that alone. Individually, you can have as much of that experience and transformation as you like, but in terms of relating to the world, in terms of changing history, in terms of the greater fulfillment, the sacred is something we have to co-generate and co-presence and co-enact together. But the other part of that, one of the issues that's very pertinent to the God discussion, is the notion of the second person other. And that's only one aspect of the God question that we explore. But I think there are a lot of ways to think about the formation of the self as being in a kind of generative loop with the other. That we are not isolated individuals. We're individual in the sense of experiencing ourselves through at least some minimal gaze of the other, like the experience of the mother and the experience of society and the experience of friends is part of the loop that's shaping us in every moment. We're not just already complete individuals. And the, let's say, abstract, evocative epitome of that loop is to be yourself in relationship to a sublime other that is present under any condition. And that's one of the most basic ways of encountering what the species tends to use the word God to point at. And we could expand that into considerations of how the second person lens is applied and all these sorts of things. But I think there's a very basic shape to our psychology, which is a relationship at the heart of our identity. And that is often what God means to us in our best moments.
Yeah. I just have a quick couple thoughts on that, but I don't want to go ahead.
Well, I just to stay with that and let you, Brandon, build on that, because the way I'm hearing, Layman, what you're describing, one could internalize that in the early tribal experience dimension, and yet within the context of a metamodern, you're describing a togethering of that you and the other inside an individuated, self-authored kind of actuality, which is different. I suppose you would say transcend and include that earlier wiring, and yet give rise to something else.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that you could, I love that framing, because that's also, right, part of the idea of what we're doing as complexifying beings and complexifying cultures, right, is that we're further individuating, but we're finding a way of of integrating that differentiation. And so you're coming back together with more parts now and more nuance, more depth, but also reconnecting back with that whole that is then able to draw on all of that new complexity to go even further in the kind of surplus emergence that it can produce. So I think that's right. The thing I was feeling like addressing to the first formulation of that question is that there's something in us that deeply wants to be seen, I think, right? And I think that we are better when we are seen. And if we can be seen, that helps us to see others as well. So this being seen fully and appreciated and being seen for who you are and that sort of a thing, is part of the crucial part of that kind of developmental process that then frees you up to then be one who can see others. And when we're able to do that, we're flourishing more. And so if we are able to be seen and see others, then that is the sort of container, or the sort of conditions that you'd need for us to be more of ourselves and be able to more optimally flourish in our context. And that there's something I also see recurring in these spaces of conversation, which is really, really crucial, I think, and it's expressed in different ways, but it's just the fundamental how would you say, transpersonal aspect to the personal, right? That we aren't these individuals. We are kind of fluid, dialectical movements between individual and collective, sort of always kind of manifesting in individual form, you can say, but it's a very porous boundary, and who I am is influenced by who both of you are, right? And of course, this scales up to our entire societies and the cultures that we grow up in, and how our sense of ego gets formed in relationship to the collective ideas that we are reared into. But it also happens at a very local level, so that when I show up in a space and you show up in a space, that specific configuration changes, what can be drawn out of me and what we can draw out of each other. And to see all of those things working together, where we are able to, again, see each other and be seen, that is where I think we kind of access that deeper, I don't know, latent reserve that's in us to become more fully who we are all supposed to be, and allow us to, ultimately meet these more complex challenges in this age that we're living in. So that's also where a lot of this is sort of directed to, is what sort of emergent capacities can a field like this generate that are the sorts that are required for our particular moment as well.
Yeah.
The diverse spread of ways of being seen here is particularly impressive, because maybe you come in as a person who's been doing bodywork therapy for 10 years. You can be met by people who understand that. But maybe you come in as an internationally renowned developmental theorist. There's people here who can see you there. They can meet that. Maybe you just want to share something personal. Maybe you show up and you finally feel comfortable in the weirdness that you are. There's an incredibly rich spread of ways to be met up and down the scale of sophistication and in and out of different thematic modes. So the opportunities to be seen and to enter into that process Brennan was just describing here are tremendously powerful. And I think one of the things that distinguishes a trans-rational from a pre-rational, or any kind of distinction like that we want to make, is the spread and richness of ways of being met. Because to do this in an ancient setting involves a very compressed identity. There's tremendous richness in the human animal all the way through, but there's a sense in which a greater homogeny and a greater simplicity is assumed in those earlier contexts. And now there's such an extraordinary richness and creative ferment, and so many different cultural and intellectual backgrounds and different scales of challenges to face, that we need to be able to recapitulate those tribal dynamics, but in a way that takes the contemporary, massively diverse, complex individual into account.
Yeah. There is a wonderful liberating and redemptive sense that's coming through what you're both describing, and I'm trying to to track three premises. So the premise one is the behavioral lab, which you have already described quite a bit, because how do you move into those experiences of accentuated and augmented intimacy and being seen and witnessed? And then you move into another experience, and you may be playful or over the lunch table or dinner table, and through this, the behavioral exploration of the expansion and the contraction that occur in the totality of a full day of a human life, of a few days. So there is that premise one, and how it allows all that you're describing. Then there is premise two that you hinted to in some of the comments you made, which I'll describe more as the perspectival crucible, where you use those moments to let the codification, complexification, mental mapping that's occurring in you while you're inside the experience, hone certain particular important points of connection and new mapping. So that's the second premise. And the third premise that I'm tracking, and I don't know whether the languaging here is going to be completely coherent, but then in a metamodern environment, I suppose anything could be explored, is this idea of looking at the collective, which is my fascination as to what the idea of a lab like this. Looking at an experience like this, the whole week, the 7 days and more you've been together, as one way to describe it as a radar dish, or possibly better as a womb for the novel and nascent emergent arisings. And I mean that more than from the human up in the ascending sense, but in the emanatory sense of my language, more than human blessing realms, that you describe perhaps, or give a permission and affordance to when you describe the spirit moves through us and speak to us and with us, where partly why I'm so fascinated with the experience is the sense that there is a bigger rolling event rolling now through humanity. And the time you've been together, you afforded whatever is trying to access the bigger human experience some kind of a magnifying glass. So to the degree that there are blessing realms that are seeking to come into a co-creative dance with humanity, a gathering like yours, or earlier in the week I conversed with few people who went to the Himalaya source on a quest to access some kind of a new appreciation on behalf of the humanity endeavor. They describe that kind of an experience. So I am sometimes I describe this for a semi-scientific mind, in the sense that this beautiful planet we call Earth is not just rotating around the sun in a repetitional sense, it is also whooshing into space around the center of the galaxy. And in that sense, we are any moment right now in a new universal zip code. So we are at our liminal edge actually experiencing, if you like, new plasma, a universal plasma washing in. Now, if you allow for a minute that to be an intelligent plasma that emanates from the core of the creative act in the universe, it affords you the permission to consider what I said in the opening, which is that today is not just a continuation of yesterday. You're actually marrying with some new potential arising. And hence the significance of an experiment like yours, because in some way you're saying, hey, we are available. If something wants to impregnate the human consciousness, we are here for it. And so I'm interested, what else would you say that joined you, that dropped into the experience in a way almost surprised you, that was somewhat miraculous or anomalous, or was not part of the predicted choreography that you designed? I said quite a bit there, so feel free to react to any of that.
Well, there are lots of different ways of conceiving the uniqueness of this world historical moment that we're in. One of the things that we're doing here is we're playing back and forth between poetic and critical mentalities frequently. So we love to explore these sorts of modes. A lot of what happens here is emergent. A lot of it's spontaneous. Sometimes we attribute that to the spirit of the place, sometimes to the collective, sometimes to the broader biosphere or the unfolding of evolutionary history or the cosmos taking a hand. When God is the theme, it's tempting to think God is taking a hand in it. What I see the system trying to do here is to create the kinds of people that are necessary to animate the sort of civilization that would be needed to solve our challenges, right? That we collectively stand in front of a situation now that is both amazing and terrifying. And there are many kinds of solutions, but none of those solutions operate without the individuals and the communities that can sustain that. So I see the system trying to make the people who will be, I use this phrase sometimes, indigenous to the liminal, to become inhabitants of this new world moment, of this time between worlds, to become the good ancestors of the people who can populate a new kind of world that will be in some ways very continuous with our ancestors, but in some ways radically strange and different because of all the tools that are at our disposal, and perhaps because the cosmic plasma has a different flavor in this region. Who knows? There are lots of strange things. Last time we had this very strange encounter with a moose. Brenda read this wonderful poem about God, and this raven joined us in the poem. So are those sorts of deeply meaningful participatory coincidences give you the feeling that something else is taking a hand in things. One of the places that's most intriguing to me is the kind of development you see in people across repetitions of the event. So people who have come several times, you see in them a change. And it's not a simple change of, oh, they're using a higher cognitive mapping set now. And it's not a narrow change like, oh, they've become really good Zazen meditators. It's something more diffuse, something more general, something that's bringing all of their humanity and complexity with them on the journey. So what I'm seeing is something is helping us to cultivate a richer tempo and reliability of overall human development in people who are cultivating the skill sets that we're making available here. But we definitely feel, at least I speak for myself here, that the field is a participant. And when I lead the meditative sittings in the mornings, it's not the way meditation feels to me at home or in other places. There's something very special here. And my meditation alternates between producing a kind of coherence as if feeding it to this field, and then receiving plans, ideas. I see, and that's one of my tasks here is to organize everything a little bit. A lot of that comes to me in those moments, that there's a back and forth, a kind of breathing in and out from the field. And when I'm here, when I'm on duty, I call it, one of my jobs is to constantly be tracking that and trying to help tweak all of us to do what it seems to want from us. Now, whether we conceive of that as a great entity that came, or we conceive of that as the momentum of what we've already generated, many ways to approach it, and we don't really want to side on any of those interpretations. We just want coherent functionality between them. But in the phenomenology of the moment, it is like it's speaking to me, speaking to us, I think.
Yeah, I that's all really well said, of course. I think it's important that we remain open to all sorts of possibilities, of influences, variables, factors, and I always like to stress that our scientific paradigms are incomplete, and it's important to be sort of always on the lookout for other external factors that might be influencing. So whatever those might be, and whether that's being in a different, astronomical zip code or what have you. I think that there's certainly, a potency that emerges out of the collective as it gathers and sort of creates a certain sort of charge amongst us. And so, whatever else we may be interacting with, I think that there's certainly something in the system that as it coheres together, and it comes and then it dissipates when we leave. But when it comes together and this configuration exists and we are accessing these kinds of emotional and cognitive intensities, I feel like something is definitely generated from that. And then, in terms of trying to think about that, potentially, say, reifying that or objectifying it for some kind of imaginal purpose and seeing what that affords is, I think, definitely something that Layman and I have discussed before in terms of like, if there is a sort of surplus spirit that we generate, what does it mean to relate to that? Do we talk to it? Do we name it? What sort of things can those kinds of modalities afford? And I think all of those are really exciting, sort of, on the edge of our thinking and our being. So I'm excited for all of that. And there are different ways that the excess shows up, I guess. And maybe there's something about those synchronicities that could be interpreted in that mode somehow. Of course, I think technically synchronicities are defined by their acausality. So trying to talk about the causes of asynchronies or synchronicities might be difficult. But if there is some kind of relationship there, that's a compelling way of thinking about it. Something that was really powerful for me personally was, as Layman mentioned, I read this passage from this poem that I'd worked on many, many years ago, which I did in isolation. I did it at a time in my life when I was part of a very small community of people, but even my work at that time was kind of opaque to them. And so I was really working through a lot of things, and it was about the sort of death of an old God concept, the emergence of a new one, and the attempt by a bunch of artists and sort of fringe thinkers to kind of reconstitute a new form of flourishing society by radically altering the existing one and throwing out kind of the consumerist, salesman who runs the whole show and building a temple to the emerging God or something like that. So that's kind of this story arc that I'd kind of worked out over some years as a kind of imaginal exercise, really, that was deeply personally, psychologically therapeutic. But here I was this past weekend reading the scene at the end of the poem where the speaker goes up into a high point in this, kind of sacred space and delivers this sort of liturgical reading. And to enact that literally by going up to the hilltop and reading this to this community, this new tribe that is all engaged in this actual project, has been for me it has this flavor of like the fulfillment of some prophecy, that I'd kind of hoped for myself in my life and what I might be able to be in service to, and then to be able to find other people that can participate with me in that, and that I can grow from and learn from. And this is a real communal effort, has just been one of the great delights of my life. And so those special moments where you're like, I wrote this at a time very isolated in a kind of aspirational gesture, and now, however many years later, I'm literally enacting this scene and performing it as though this had almost been a script for this moment, generates a sort of experience in me of some people, again, and maybe a traditional Christian framework might say, well, that's a God moment or something like that. So those are a couple of things.
Yeah, Brandon. Then sometimes the imaginal becomes actual. In your case, literally so. So, to the degree that you feel prepared to speak to that, if there are some crucible moments of challenge that may be relevant to address, because in several of the previous conversations with Layman, Layman would bring the awareness of the need for some constructive, creative friction and the ways in which we can ensure and validate that we are not bypassing our way into advanced coherence. So I wonder if in any way there were any dimensions of that in the experience, spontaneous or choreographed. And you already mentioned that you design moments where you shift perspectival emphasis to kind of catalyze creative friction. But to the degree that you want to speak to that or to anything else, where we squeeze ourselves out of our comfort zone, that would be instructive to integrate that as well in your reflection.
There are several different types of friction opportunities here. We don't want to overwhelm anyone, but we also want to constantly invite them to be at their edge. One is that I'm always barefoot in the forest, and some people feel tempted to join me in the muck and in the poked feet of it all. Another is we were discussing the interpersonal appreciation ritual that we have. This time it included what terrifies us about each other. There's also, in this case, the special friction of people who come together with a metamodern sensibility and an interest in co-creating community and ritual, but some are very clearly on a lifelong religious path, and some are very clearly on what they think of as a secular, atheist, or agnostic path that have always found that to be either uninteresting or problematic. And how do those people negotiate that boundary to find what they have in common and create higher, more integrated concepts of how to move forward on this? That's 3 examples, I think.
Yeah. And I would say, the way that the emergent ritual gets constructed, and at every stage, both in the construction, there's always this edge of chaos element, and that's where emergence comes from. So there's always this sense of things coming together, but maybe something shifting. There's always this possibility for something new to shift things around. When we enter those chaotic moments or experiences, that's often experienced with anxiety, apprehension, some kind of concern. But that's also, productive and the source of what eventually can sort of seemingly almost magically converge into something very coherent and beautiful by the end. So there's always something, and then the other aspect is not just making the ritual, but participating in the ritual. Showing up and having the trust of being led through the woods, and there's always this unpredictability element that's always that source of potential instability and chaos that you never quite know how exactly that's going to pan out. But it's in being open to all of that you have the sort of plasticity in which something really super coherent can also show up. And so I think there's a trust that happens. There's a faith that you kind of extend to the universe and the way these things unfold. And I think that apprehension is also then the necessary set of conditions for that coherence. But obviously, also we're all human beings, and we might disagree with each other here or there, or there's some kind of interpersonal tension that might show up here or there. And I think that's also essential. That's also part of who we are. I think learning to deftly navigate and to integrate and to resolve and all those things. Certainly, those aren't the kind of the cornerstone experiences of these things. But here and there, we're all kind of navigating each other, meeting each other, and those sorts of things. So I guess the other challenges are, for me as the host and kind of the logistical juggling that goes into these things can be a kind of exercise that as we're doing more of these, I feel like I'm gaining a certain capacity over time. And so again, if we see these things as kind of like working a muscle, there's a strain there that's required to get the strength. And so I think most of what happens in terms of those various strains are ultimately in service to something that makes us stronger. So yeah, I guess I would those would be some of my comments.
Sometimes friction.
Throw in one more. Sorry, there's often just sheer physical effort as well, right? You're gardening. We spend a lot of time hauling rocks. It's constructive and it's enjoyable, but there's real physical efforts, and they can put people up against an edge as well.
Yes. Well, so sometimes friction will arise from practical living conditions, and physical hardship, even working in the garden for some who are not used to it, could be difficult. Sometimes differences will arise, and perhaps you have transcended these long time ago, in surfacing of other topics in the periphery, political differences, and I don't know, even Canadian-American dimensions and other such like elements. Sometimes
Layman and I learned long ago to resolve the deep antagonisms that exist between our two countries. So,
and may the fractal be transmitted to the greater whole. Sometimes in an intensive experience like this, the friction can arise more as a byproduct of the energetic experiential overload and how the loading in the system, when there isn't enough passage and a way to a safety valve and exhausting of some of the impressions and the experience, by way of including a person's other parts that are not were not able to be brought into the conversation, that sometimes will create a pressure in the system that will surprise the person, and where we will surprise each other. So, but you're describing that most everybody is versatile and experienced in circumstances like this, so perhaps these were non-issues.
Well, I appreciate that. That's a very precise observation, Aviv. And yes, there's a lot of people here who are here precisely because they have this really rich ability to circulate the different modes of their being, create a lot of internal integration, and move fluidly between alternative perspectives while maintaining coherence. That's the norm we're setting. But the energetics of the field and the fact that that's the norm causes people who have something outstanding, especially if they feel met and trusted and safe, to have some kinds of arisings and awakenings. And there were several events this time, there usually are, where someone is going through a catharsis or a reprocessing or an interesting moment where they get to share something that normally goes unheard or uncomprehended in their other life conversations. And everybody here is learning the skill of how we handle that. Does somebody become the point person, so to speak, and deal with that person? Does it require a couple of people? Do they just need space? What do you have to go through in order to enter more deeply into this kind of field and its norms? So we see a lot of that happen, and a lot of that, from my experiential point of view, has to do directly with the sometimes overload capacity of the field. I struggle with that myself because one of my tasks in leading it is to like pedal the interpersonal field or always be rolling the ball somehow. And that is incredibly energizing for me. And it risks being draining and it risks being overloading as well. So one of the things I'm learning is how much I can do where and when I have to go aside to rest and recuperate to prevent the overload from destabilizing me. But I think what we're all learning is how to more playfully and flexibly and mutually play at the edge of overload together.
Is there a sense of a growing intuition of what will a metamodern God have us be and do, if you were to try to speak from within the experience? Almost in a, well, to be biblical for a moment, in a commandment language would be one way to invite you to do so. In more perhaps metamodern context, if there was a brief, so I'd invite you to do that, and then I'd invite you to also address in parallel, if a metamodern God has a shadow, what is it?
Good, very fun and important question. Yeah, I'm inclined not to use the kind of biblical injunction language precisely because I feel like that is very sort of aesthetically and sort of cognitively and let's say structurally specific to a particular mode of the God concept, you could say, right? So this is a way into this question maybe, and it could be done, but I'm more inclined to say, well, if it's not the 10 commandments, is it the 10 invitations? Is it the 10 insights? Is it the 10 whatever? And I think that one of the things that comes up for me a lot, and we explored this a lot in the lab, was the way in which what had to be prohibitive or given as an injunction, as a divine command, I think blossoms into a kind of intrinsic expression of the volition of people as you develop deeper into a more nuanced and complex God relationship. And so, in the same way that I don't talk to my wife and say, this is what you must do. It's the nature of our relationship is dialectical, and it's conversational, and it's mutual, and it's out of our shared commitment to create something and be committed to something beautiful and mutually enriching that we act the way that we act. And I think that there's a movement towards this metamodern God that would be more in that vein, that is much more emerges out of a broader, let's say, emerges from the broadening of one's horizons to see more and more of the bigger picture in such a way that one intuits the direct impacts that one has on the world, on the other, on themselves. And so the actions that we take are no longer prescribed by means of sort of external injunctions. They come from within, and they come to as a sort of self-imposed constraint for the well-being, for the maximal well-being of self and other and world. And that's sort of pointing to a kind of moral aspect to that question. But I also go back to those experiences in that appreciation circle where that sense gets generated, and it gets generated by this sort of flowing channel of love that we've all kind of been almost like heating up, like this sort of forge. It's sort of been glowing now, and now there's this kind of radiant energy to this sort of love that we're all sitting with. And I think that if we could go forth and operate from that space with others, and that was more of our default, imagine how different the world would be, right? And if the God that we're generating in a space that can appreciate the other in so many different modes and perspectives, and a God that we generate from being able to see and be seen, and a God that we generate out of the sort of surplus cohesion of deepened intimacy and love, that God, I think, is one that calls us to live out in the world more from that mode of being. And if we could begin to reorganize ourselves according to that sensibility, and begin to think more in those terms, and begin to extend that practice further, so that it's not just happening around a wood stove at Sky Meadow, but it's happening across the entire collective as far as we're capable of doing this. Imagine the transformation that would occur. And in a way, doesn't that seem precisely like the sort of transformation that would be needed to help meet the challenges that we're in? So I think that's the orientation that the metamodern God
just staying with you for a moment. Just staying for a moment with Brendan. Right there is perhaps, Brendan, a prophecy being fulfilled. I don't know if you know that. This is something I used in a book I published some nearly 10 years ago. The word Messiah in Hebrew is the word Mashiach. The letters of the word Mashiach in Hebrew are the same word as Messiah, and which is just, you pronounce that letter a little differently. And what the meaning of that word is literally conversing. So when you turn it into a verb, the idea of Messiah is to be in conversation. In that sense, perhaps there is a way of integrating the biblical prophecy into a metamodern context in a way that's inclusive of it, rather than excluding that permission.
Were you going to say something, Layman?
I appreciate that. The imaginal prompt around what would the metamodern God say is intriguing to play with. In a non-dogmatic sense, I think it's saying, first of all, gather. Come together, lean into your typical sufferings, lean into the spaces between your perspectives and between your behavior patterns, and find the vibe of transdisciplinarity. Right? We need all of these different disciplines working together, but it's not just a mental map of how they fit together. It's a feeling quality that they share at their intersection. Find that, treat that as sacred, protect it, take it back into the world, unfold your legitimate strangeness, move toward spiritual and existential depths with your full humanity in all of its vulnerability and peculiarity and its oppositionalities. Take all of that with you. Deepen into high trust subnetworks. Do your metacognitive psychotechnology practices. You have to be doing real inner work, intentionally reorganizing yourself all the time to keep up with this. And that's something the wisdom traditions have long told us, but that has to be a big part of this. And that's one of the reasons metamodern spirituality is a little different than some of the other metamodern studies, is the emphasis we put on not only community, but on experimental inner practice and the life of the inner world. But the other thing that comes up for me is what Zarathustra says in the prologue to Thus Spake Zarathustra, where he says to the incipient community of the future, the adventurers and experimenters that he sees coming over the horizon, he says, be true to the earth, be true to the body, and let your will say that the ultra-human is the meaning of the earth. So whatever you're doing, do it ecologically, do it in tandem with the biosphere and the land, do it in a deeply embodied way. Make sure that your understandings pass into your body. Make sure you understand that your psyche is emergent from, or at least deeply entangled with, everything about the organism, and that you have to practice and move together and do it here, not just here, but also that the problems of the meaning crisis and of the fractured nature of the late modern world require a different kind of human being, a deeper, inhuman, transhuman, more fully human kind of character, kind of community of characters that are capable of living in this new environment, and that we can opt into the attempt to cultivate that from out of ourselves, or at least to open the space for those kind of people to inhabit the future. I think that's for me, that's part of the spirit of the metamodern divinity, so to speak.
And I'll pick up. You asked, Aviv, about being able to include the biblical and the you could also extend that into other traditional religions and whatnot, and not exclude them going forward. There's something about the moment that we're experiencing, we're going through, that calls up to mind all of those archetypal scenes of exodus and passage and desert wandering and going up the mountain and calling forth and carving new tablets and this sort of a thing. I think that there's something like a Genesis experience, meaning that not just that we're, not to call specifically on the book of Genesis, because most of what I said is in Exodus, but I mean that we are at an originary point of something new emerging, and that we can meaningfully draw, I think, significant emotional and spiritual parallels to various stories, passages, ideas, visions from these traditional lineages, and make use of them in very productive ways, and to be both very open and excited to do so, also very scared to do so and hesitant to do so because of all the implications of that kind of languaging. But we also need to be a bit bold and audacious as well, and draw from those powerful frames of reference to be able to one, draw that continuity back into the past and see that we are in some senses continuing an ancient story of humanity moving through and progressing through and developing its relationship with the sacred in continual relationship with its environmental conditions to adapt to new circumstances and move the ball forward, but also to get that kind of fire in us that inspires us to go forward into the discontinuity, by being able to draw on those sorts of reserves and to see that what we're doing collectively at this moment together is somewhat unparalleled, but it's also quite paralleled in its being unparalleled in the past. So we can draw inspiration from that, and I think hopefully have a bit more strength and faith to go forward with that at our back.
At the risk of overloading this section of the discussion, two more came up for me while you were saying that, Brendan. One is a kind of commandment to normalize the extraordinary, right? That we really should be trying to set up conditions where we live where peaks and appreciations and brilliance and unbelievable vistas, you should be able to walk down to breakfast and hear some of the smartest people in the world having the best conversations and feel overwhelmed in love and see gorgeous things and have deep experiences of the spirit and even strange, almost paranormal kinds of synchronous encounters. That should be not an occasional rare thing gifted upon the world. It should be the everyday condition of our lives. So normalize the extraordinary and also produce from out of the shared metamodern spirit, right? New memes, new artifacts, new ways of imagining God, new rituals. We've got these, we've got copies of my Gurdjieff book here as sort of the first book from Sky Meadow Press. But Sky Meadow Press is an opportunity for all of the people who come here to generate artifacts, to make books, to teach lessons, to go back into the world and make, to generate from out of this spirit and seed the world with things that have this kind of a flavor.
Well, these last couple of rounds from you carry the note of a call to action and a call to beingness, and perhaps we shouldn't extend it beyond this point, because it has the poignancy of the rich texture and the imbuing spirit that you've co-generated and been immersed by and with each other. So what I've experienced here today is a rich cascading sense of the texture of the ground and the place and the vista and the interpersonal richness and transparency and vulnerability that you have allowed with each other in the name of the cause of the inquiry, of the shared inquiry, and the wanting to live into the inquiry even beyond the conceptualizing mind, which perhaps, if there could be a hint to what could be a risk of a shadow element in the metamodern, that one way to describe it is that the recursive, integrating, transcending move can sometime move so quickly that it could be a case where it loses the richness of the swelling from below. And what you have just shared was that you've had so much of it in the generosity and the spirit of kindness of being with each other into the liminal frontier, each in themselves and with each other. So I don't know if there is anything, but I'd want to make the space, if there is anything you want to say beyond that of what you're now looking forward to next, or we can just conclude it here as a way of ending with those potent, evocative transmission you've just each made from the presence that's imbuing you inside the experience.
Well, maybe we would drop one seed, which is what we're looking forward to is after God is the goddess. And how does this show up in a richer, more feminine mode? How do cycles, how do embodiments, how do all that kind of material we associate with yin, what does it do differently or the same in that kind of a language? So we're looking forward to a more feminine version of this next time. And I also want to say to you, Aviv, it's tremendously nourishing and I think useful to be seen, to be reflected upon, and to have your eye encountering us while we're still in the midst of it. I think that's very useful feedback that we'll be taking with us. We can only you can only see so much from within it, and to have someone else with a good eye point out some of the structures and some of the patterns, and to have that reinforce the sense of what we've actually gone through, it's a blessing. Thank you.
Yeah. Go on.
No, I was just going to say, somebody who waited all the way to the end of the conversation with when Layman said, well, the next time Ron is going to be around the goddess, will say, well, now you're talking, you have my attention. I bet some people would say yes. Please, Brendan, what were you?
Yeah, I was just going to echo Layman's comment of appreciation and thanks for holding space for us to be able to reflect on this and dialogue about it. That's deeply helpful for my integration of these experiences. And we did, going back now, this has sort of actually been its own kind of emergent tradition in some ways, that when these end, we'll have an occasion to talk about it. And we have done some podcasts doing that, and didn't have anything this time set up or planned, but this occasion to do this reminds me how really important that is, and to have someone to dialogue with about this, and to bring out things that might have been there but latent, or implied but made explicit now. So thank you both for this opportunity, and with your the depth of your inquiry, and I really appreciate it and grateful.
To be continued. Thank you so very much. Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.